Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to a good, crispy morning in beautiful Vancouver. And this is actually our first fall. This is our first fall webinar event. So few housekeeping things. If you can switch off your video and mic, that will be great. But if you want to keep your video on, it's all good too. But definitely switch off your mics. Second thing is, if you have any question, if you can put it in the chat box of your screen, that will be pretty good, and we'll be picking questions. And the way I try to do is just build a story around how we are presenting this event. So we'll be picking the questions as we go. So feel free to ask, and the more questions we have, more value we get out of the session. So really look forward to something interesting over the next 45 minutes. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Pankaj. Great to be here.
Yeah, so why don't you start with tell a little bit about Kobalt, your background. Sure. Why do you think you are so good in what you do? Yeah.
Yeah, so Kobalt is a cybersecurity services company focused on small and mid-sized firms. We've been in business for just shy of 2 years, and we've been working primarily with tech companies across BC, Canada, and North America. You know, I've been in cybersecurity for 20 years. It's a real passion of mine. You know, selling and working with businesses of all different sizes, a lot of global 50s and larger enterprises. And cybersecurity has been really an unsolved problem down in the smaller end of the market. And so our real passion is about solving that problem and addressing cybersecurity needs for small and mid-sized firms. And so we help organizations assess their programs, build them out, and operate so that they can solve their cybersecurity challenges without the need to build expensive teams and staff and solve those problems with internal resources.
So how do you differentiate between, because cybersecurity is a very oftenly used word, how is it different from, I mean, you know, I started or I entered the industry in 1990 or so. What we used to have, number one, it was that not that big an issue that time. It was that if you have antivirus and few things here or there, you're okay.
Yeah.
And how is it different from IT security in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think cybersecurity has become kind of a default name in the industry. I'm not a fan of it in the same way that I'm not really a fan of artificial intelligence and other sorts of kind of catchy marketing phrases, but it's sort of a norm that people have landed around to deal with kind of a general broad term around online threats and attacks. You know, in the early days, as you mentioned, like cybersecurity was mostly around viruses and those sorts of attacks. And, you know, as actors have gotten more sophisticated, attackers, cyber criminals have started building more complex attack forms, cybersecurity has become kind of much more the catchphrase of the day. And so we see attacks not just in terms of malware, but we see targeted compromises, we see social engineering attacks, we see a variety of different kind of forms that, you know, have a much more significant impact on business than ever in the past. One of the things that the criminals have gotten really good at is you know, targeting the financial assets of organizations and having very significant damaging outcomes. Whereas, you know, 20 years ago it was kids in mom's basements, and it was much more kind of fun hacking kind of stuff rather than, you know, serious criminal enterprises. And, you know, just to give you a sense of scale of how big the industry problem is today, the cybersecurity criminal elements bring in more revenue every year than the annual drug trade, right? And so that gives you a sense of just scale and impact to the businesses that are impacted by it.
Yeah, we come across customers who are paying like money to get whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you got
username, password back or whatever. Yeah,
ransomware attacks. You've got, you know, business email fraud where people are, you know, intercepting payments in motion. You've got the classic data breach where people are compromising records and you know, leaking confidential information. So there's a whole variety of different ways people are being attacked these days, and it's getting harder and harder for, you know, smaller teams who don't necessarily have the resources and expertise to defend themselves.
So a typical use case would be, as our clients are moving to the cloud, maybe Azure, AWS, Google, whatever.
Yep.
So let's say data center provides me all the security, etc. I just moved to cloud. So what changes? I still have the same admin and user and whatever. How is it different? So the scenario is, if I am moving to, say, Azure, all my infrastructure has moved there. What are the, like, say, top 3 questions maybe I should ask, or what are the 3 things I should be aware of? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. So there's really a few different primary considerations. One of them is like, how are you adopting cloud, right? So it's one thing to adopt cloud on the infrastructure level, right? So I'm considering lifting and shifting out of my own internal data center or a third-party data center into an Azure environment or an AWS environment, right? So that's infrastructure as a service where I'm buying compute and storage and this kind of stuff, kind of basically moving my workloads over to the cloud. So that's one cloud application. The big mistake that people typically make, and this is more of a business level decision, is they move from a secure data center environment where the data center is providing, you know, web application firewalls and DDoS protection and a bunch of other layers, and they move into a fairly bare bones Microsoft or AWS environment where those additional security layers aren't built in.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're mismapping the responsibilities of security from one player to the other player, right? And so that creates an additional risk associated with that move. So that's one kind of scenario. Another scenario where I think there's actually a huge opportunity for improved security is people who are moving their applications to the cloud, right? And so, you know, traditionally, if you think about running your own internal Exchange server, right? You know, you got to patch it, you got to keep it up to date, you got to, you know, make sure that you can take advantage of the new features when they roll out, compared to operating on O365, which is constantly kept current, you know, has got native multi-factor authentication, these sorts of things. So applications moved to the cloud, you're actually handing a lot of the security responsibilities over to the application provider,
Yep.
and you know, it can end up with a lot better outcomes if you implement it properly.
So what should they do? Where to start?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple places to start. So one is really understanding and doing some security architecture work up front when you're doing your cloud adoption, right? So mapping out kind of who has what responsibilities as it relates to the cloud provider versus, you know, your organization versus third parties, right? And so, you know, classically, I mentioned earlier this infrastructure as a service. So there's this concept of a shared responsibility model. Typically, the cloud provider is responsible for the hardware, the physical security of the cloud data centers, the hypervisor, and then the business itself is responsible for, you know, the application stack on top of that, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of one scenario, and you can do some architecture work to say, all right, I need to put some security controls in front of my application stack, right? So I might, you know, put a WAF or, you know, some sort of cloud security controls in addition, right? Another scenario is where you're buying something like a platform as a service. Say you're using a Heroku, for example, right? So in that case, your area of responsibility is actually very narrow because you're just responsible for the code. And so then you have to make sure you're doing code security well, but you don't necessarily need to worry about the top and bottom layers of the infrastructure quite so much. So start with a security architecture that really looks at, you know, who is responsible for what, and then you can map in controls to fill the gaps.
And what about me as a user? So what is that I should demand from my infrastructure providers, like multi-factor authentication? I know you are a big fan. You are leading that initiative. Yeah, maybe you can share about that initiative also. I think you've got a lot of signatures now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're about 350 signatures on our way to 500. So yeah. I've started an initiative to kind of get the Canadian government to require banks to offer multi-factor authentication for free to consumer accounts and stuff like this. The banks tend to be a little bit laggards as it relates to that particular aspect of security, which is unfortunate. And the banks are seen as a industry leader. And so where the banks are slow, other organizations are slow as well. So multi-factor authentication is one of the best things that individual users can do to help secure their cloud accounts, right? And so for those of you who aren't familiar with it, basically it could be a text message to your phone or an authenticator app. We typically recommend using an authenticator app. It's a one-time code, so that in addition to your username and password, you have to enter this code when you access that site. And the real reason I'm such a proponent of multi-factor authentication is that it reduces account compromises by over 99%, right? It's not a silver bullet, but it's as close as a silver bullet as you can get as it relates to individual account protection. And so, you know, we encourage you to use multi-factor authentication wherever you can. But the three critical things that I talk about a lot are your email accounts, right? So this is your Office 365, your G Suite, right? Because your email accounts are kind of the key to everything else inside of your kind of life online, right? So all your other accounts tend to do password resets and stuff to your email account. The second would be your cloud credentials, right? So if you think about your Azure, your AWS administrators, they should be using multi-factor authentication whenever they're authenticating into your cloud platforms. Yeah. So again, that reduces the risk of those core assets. And the third is your code repositories. Again, your developers, if their accounts are compromised and those code repositories are compromised, that can lead to downstream impact on your infrastructure. And so again, protect that with multi-factor authentication. That could be GitHub or Azure DevOps, those sorts of things. And so, those are the three, but generally you want to implement multi-factor authentication wherever you can. And once you've implemented it in one place, it's pretty easy to add others, and you've got the app on your phone.
So let me, you are called many times when there is something which has happened. I think that's where you get a lot of your business. If something has gone wrong, people want to get the vaccine for the next time.
Yeah.
And tell me an example which you think was the most, interesting is the wrong word to say, but yeah, maybe last 12 months. I know one example which I'm associated with that firm as a stakeholder, where the email, the bank account, somebody changed and suddenly the $200,000 went to a different account.
Yeah. So there's been a few attacks specifically recently where we've seen an issue where an account from an executive was compromised because of a credential stuffing attack. And so the way credential stuffing attacks work is, say, Pankaj, you're not using a LastPass or 1Password, you're not using something that has a unique password for every website. In us being us, we tend to be lazy, and so we reuse our password in a bunch of different sites. And so, one of those sites gets compromised, and the attackers then take that username and password and spray it everywhere they can to see what else they can get access to. And so we've seen a couple instances where that led to access to the executive's email account, and then that email account is compromised, and all the data held within that email account is therefore available to the attacker. So if you think about everything you email back and forth over the course of 6 months, it could be, if you're an executive, it could be personnel records, client information, all this kind of stuff. All of that was, leaked and, represented a threat and a risk that, easily could have been dealt with stronger account security, right? So that's one scenario. Another scenario that we saw was $150,000 transfer that was intercepted. And so there was a communication between a client and a supplier, and one of the accounts of one of those individuals had been compromised over an extended period of time. And say that we're talking back and forth about a contract, and then in the middle of that communication, because the attacker had persistent access to that email thread, they inserted a special message that said, hey, we've changed our bank because our previous bank was under audit. Here's where you transfer the payment to. And they had registered a very similar lookalike domain and had $150,000 transferred and siphoned away within minutes. Wow. And so fortunately in that case, we were able to, confirm that the attack had occurred and given them evidence, and they were able to get to the bank and get the money recovered. Fortunately, one of the things that we try to do is actually help our customers be proactive, so they're not fighting fire so much as kind of, preventing them from getting out of hand in the first place.
Yeah, so actually that's a good segue into my next question, is more of the proactive thing.
Yeah.
Like we used to, and I don't know security much, but like ethical hacking or advanced penetration testing when we develop applications, etc. Those proactive things, do they help or?
They absolutely help, right? So penetration testing is a great way to make sure that your application is secure. It's less likely to be compromised by an attacker. So we do penetration testing against your cloud applications and also your infrastructure. Yeah. Awareness training is one of the most cost-effective things that you can do with your staff, right? So if you think about it, your staff are your kind of first line and your last line of defense. And so they're constantly receiving emails and threats and attacks. And so if they just know not to click on it or to report it to IT if something does happen, then you can reduce the risk of an incident actually occurring in the first place. Security monitoring is another big one for us, which is us being able to see all the events across an organization's infrastructure and see early signs of risk and attack before they become more serious. And so that's a very good investment that a lot of organizations can make to reduce the risk of something getting out of hand.
Actually, before we go deeper into the security questions, maybe can you cover a little bit of, this is off the main topic, but about the privacy? Mm-hmm. And because more and more questions we are, particularly on cloud, where data resides, data residency, PC, Privacy Act, and some of those things. So maybe some cue on how or what to do about it, yeah?
Yeah, so privacy is a very large topic, especially here in British Columbia, because we have very specific regulations around privacy and residency of data, right? So we have protections that say, basically, you're not supposed to move BC resident data outside of Canada without explicit permission and consent. And the reality is, like most organizations that are working with BC citizen data are doing this on a regular basis. It's just making sure that they understand, follow the law, and gain consent. The key thing to understand about privacy is you need to make sure that the user understands what you are doing with the data, that you have explicitly documented that, and you're gaining consent when they sign up to your applications and these sorts of things. The government ends up being much more restricted because they can't force users to use a service where their data is being stored south of the border and stuff like this. But a lot of this comes out of fear of the U.S. Patriot Act and the fact that the government in the United States can basically go into service providers in the U.S. and take citizen data without really a lot of controls in place. And so that's really actually slowed down a lot of cloud adoption, especially in the public sector here in British Columbia. And so, we do, privacy impact assessments and kind of privacy reviews for clients to help them understand, are they doing things properly, making sure that they're gaining the right kind of consent, they've got the right type of documentation. Again, for most private enterprises, it's not so much an issue of what you can do, it's just making sure that you're documenting and gaining proper permissions. But privacy is a big problem because, organizations leak data all the time, they get compromised, and that has a lot of impact. The big kind of thing that's been a big shadow over the whole industry is the GDPR in Europe, where the fines associated with privacy violations can be up to 4% of organizations' global annual turnover. And so that's where we've seen Google and others pay billions of dollars in fines.
So now,